Tonight, we bring you the haunting story of the shadows in the pines, a gripping account of a small town's sinister secret that will send shivers down your spine. As we unravel the chilling mystery of Camden and its cursed woods, be prepared for a journey into fear, betrayal, and an ancient evil that refuses to let go. So dim the lights, grab a blanket, and settle in. This is one story you won't want to miss. And if you enjoy true crime and horror stories that blur the line between fiction and reality, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you never miss a chilling tale. It had been over a year since the last disappearance. Since then, Camden had become a town trapped in time, held captive by the unease that had settled over it like a heavy fog. The once lively community had quieted, the streets never as bustling, the sounds of children playing never as joyful. Every corner of Camden was haunted by the memory of the disappearances, people who had simply vanished without a trace. The feeling of being watched, of something always lurking in the shadows, had become a part of life. It was late in the evening when Paul Grant, the town's deputy sheriff, first noticed the strange figure standing by the old pines on the edge of town. It was just a silhouette at first, a shadow in the fading light of the sun. But something about it seemed wrong. The figure stood motionless, too still, as if it were waiting for something or someone. Paul had driven past the pines many times before, his eyes skimming over the familiar scenery. But that evening, something was different. He could feel his heart rate quicken as he slowed his car. There was something about the way the figure stood that made his skin crawl. It was almost as if it didn't belong there, as if it was out of place in the natural world. For a brief moment, Paul thought about stopping, but a sudden surge of anxiety rushed through him, urging him to drive on. The figure didn't move. It wasn't long before the first report came in. A young woman, Clara Thompson, had gone missing. She was only 23, a college student who had returned home for the summer to visit her family. No one had seen her after she went out for a walk that afternoon, and her parents were frantic. As the sheriff's department scrambled to gather information, they quickly realized the disappearance was eerily similar to the others that had occurred in the past. The last time something like this had happened, it had been 2 years ago. Camden had already been shaken by the loss of 3 other residents, but after Clara disappeared, the sense of terror became palpable. The town couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister lurking in the woods, waiting for the right moment to strike. Days passed without a single lead. The investigation seemed to stall, despite the efforts of the sheriff's department. Paul, who had been with the force for just over 5 years, had never been one to give up easily. But this was different. The pattern, the strange events surrounding each disappearance, had started to gnaw at him. No one had ever found any evidence of foul play. No signs of struggle, no body. The victims simply vanished. He had to admit to himself that there was no logical explanation for what was happening. And the longer he thought about it, the more Paul's mind turned to that shadow in the pines, the figure he had seen, standing motionless in the evening light. It was like the figure was connected to the disappearances somehow, a part of whatever had overtaken Camden. That night, Paul decided to go out to the pines. His instincts were screaming at him, telling him that whatever was happening, whatever was causing the terror in Camden, was tied to those woods. The place had always been creepy, even as a child. The towering pine trees cast long, dark shadows in the dusk, and there was something about the stillness of the area that unsettled him. No birds chirped, no wind rustled the branches. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He parked his car a few yards away and stepped out into the cool night air. The moon was full, casting a pale light across the landscape. As he moved closer to the edge of the woods, a strange unease began to settle in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as if someone or something was watching him. The closer he got to the pines, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around him, blocking out the moonlight. He could hear nothing but the pounding of his own heart, a steady thrum in his ears. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The shadow. The figure standing between the trees, barely discernible in the darkness. This time it wasn't still. It was moving toward him. Paul froze. a cold sweat trickling down his spine. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and as it moved closer, he could see that its outline was blurred, like a smear of darkness against the moonlight. There was no discernible face, no features at all, just a shifting mass of shadow. Without thinking, Paul drew his flashlight and aimed it at the figure. But when the beam hit it, the figure vanished, just like that, as if it had never been there. Paul's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back, his mind racing. What was that thing? And why couldn't anyone else see it? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps crunching in the dry leaves behind him. He whipped around, his flashlight flicking back and forth, but there was no one there. "Hello?" Paul called out, his voice shaky. No answer. The following day, the search for Clara continued, but there were no new developments. The town was on edge, and people were growing desperate. People began to whisper about the pines, about the strange happenings in the woods. Some talked of the figure Paul had seen, claiming it was a ghost, others calling it a shadow demon, or even a shapeshifter. But the whispers were nothing more than superstition until the second figure appeared. It was an elderly woman named Martha Willard, a lifelong resident of Camden. She had been walking her dog through the woods as she had done countless times before, when something strange happened. Her dog had run ahead, barking at something in the trees. When Martha followed, she found herself face to face with the figure. This time, she wasn't the only one who saw it. Martha's dog, a large, shaggy golden retriever, had stopped barking and was now cowering at her feet, whimpering. Martha, too, had frozen. The figure was standing between two trees just like before. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. She described it as a tall, shifting shadow, something unnatural, like the very darkness itself had taken form. But there was something new this time. Martha claimed that she had seen the figure's eyes. They were white, glowing, and they pierced through her like a pair of icy daggers. And when she looked into them, she saw something that wasn't right. It wasn't just fear or anger that radiated from the eyes. There was an emptiness, a void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The whispers in Camden had taken on a life of their own. What had once been idle gossip between neighbors had now turned into something far darker. People were afraid to leave their homes at night, and the police could barely keep up with the mounting reports of strange sightings and unexplained events. The town, once a quiet, peaceful community, had transformed into a place of fear and suspicion, and the figure in the pines, whatever it was, seemed to be at the heart of it all. Paul Grant couldn't shake the image of those white, glowing eyes. The look that Martha Willard had described had haunted him in the days following her encounter. There was something so unnatural about it, something so deeply unsettling. He had seen fear in the eyes of the people who came to him with their stories, but nothing compared to the terror that came from Martha's account. Whatever it wasn't just a person or even a ghost. It was something far older, far more malevolent, and Paul had to find it. Days turned into weeks, and the disappearances continued. The town was on edge, but the sheriff's department had no new leads. The pattern was disturbingly familiar. Every victim, just like the others, vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no clues left behind. It was as if they had simply been swallowed by the earth itself. The only thing that connected them all was the strange figure. Paul had started spending more time near the pines, trying to track any unusual activity, but the figure had remained elusive. No one had seen it directly since Martha's encounter, but the eerie sense of something being present, something watching, never left. At night, the woods seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there. One evening, as Paul sat in his squad car, parked on the edge of the pines, he noticed a flicker of movement between the trees. His heart skipped a beat as he strained his eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he was certain he had seen something. The moon hung high above, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The pines swayed gently in the breeze, but all around, the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Paul grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the woods. The trees seemed to close in around him. the underbrush thick and tangled. The further he walked, the more oppressive the silence became. There was no rustling of leaves, no sound of animals moving through the underbrush. It was as though all life had abandoned the area. And then he saw it. At first it was just a shape, a darker patch against the backdrop of the night. But as Paul's flashlight swept across the area, he saw it clearly. A figure, tall and still, standing between two trees. This time the figure was closer. Paul's breath caught in his throat as he froze, the beam of his flashlight shaking in his hand. It was not human. The figure seemed to bend and shift, its outline indistinct, as if the shadows themselves were warping around it. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, like a grotesque caricature of a person. The face, if it could even be called that, was a blur, an empty void where features should have been. But the eyes, they were unmistakable. Those white, glowing eyes staring right at Paul. Paul stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. And then, in a flash, it was gone, disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. For a moment, Paul stood frozen, unable to process what he had just witnessed. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead. The thing in the woods wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a figment of someone's imagination. It was real, and it was waiting for something, or someone. The following morning, Paul gathered the sheriff and his team for a meeting. They had to do something. The town couldn't take much more of this fear, this uncertainty. The disappearances were escalating, and the townspeople were growing more desperate. But Paul couldn't shake the feeling that there was something far more sinister at play. Something that had been lying dormant in the pines for longer than anyone realized. "We need to search the woods," Paul said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I know it's dangerous, but if this thing is real, we need to find it before it takes someone else." Sheriff Thompson nodded grimly. He had seen his share of bizarre cases, but nothing like this. "You're right, but we need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." As they prepared for the search, Paul felt a chill settle in the pit of his stomach. They could search the woods all they wanted, but deep down, he knew that finding the figure wasn't going to be as simple as just tracking it down. This thing, whatever it was part of Camden's past. Something that had been hidden away in the shadows for far too long. That evening, as they made their way into the woods, the air felt thick with tension. The pines loomed overhead, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The group moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, scanning for any sign of the figure. Hours passed, and the group found nothing. The woods were eerily silent, as though all life had disappeared. It wasn't until Paul stumbled upon an old overgrown trail that he began to feel the weight of something watching him again. This trail, he had seen it before, as a child. It led to an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a place that had been forgotten by most of the town. It had once belonged to a man named Ezra Harrington, a hermit who had lived alone in the woods decades ago. But after a string of strange incidents, Ezra had disappeared, and the cabin had been left. As Paul approached the cabin, the air grew colder. The old wooden structure creaked in the wind, its windows dark and empty. There was no sign of life, but Paul could feel the presence of something inside. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside of the cabin was just as decayed as the outside. Broken furniture lay in piles, and the floorboards were warped and rotting. But as Paul's flashlight scanned the room, his eyes locked onto something that made his blood run cold. On the far wall, scrawled in what appeared to be blood, were symbols, strange ancient markings that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. And at the center of the symbols was one word, written in jagged, twisted script. Watcher? The room seemed to close in around Paul, the oppressive air thickening. His heart raced as the realization hit him. This wasn't just a random occurrence. The disappearances, the figure, the strange symbols, all of it was connected. It was part of something much darker, something that had been hidden in the town for generations. He turned back to the door, but as he did, he heard a sound. a slow, deliberate tap, 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 echoing from the other side of the room. Slowly, Paul's flashlight drifted toward the noise, and there, standing in the corner, was the figure that had been haunting Camden, the Watcher. This time it wasn't just a shadow, it was real, its form solidifying before Paul's eyes. The white glowing eyes locked onto his, and the air around them seemed to hum with a malevolent energy. Paul stumbled back, his flashlight dropping to the floor. The figure took a step forward, its limbs twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. It was no longer just an observer. It was coming for him. The air inside the cabin grew colder as Paul stumbled backward, his feet slipping against the worn floorboards. The Watcher had moved closer. Its presence was suffocating, a crushing weight on his chest. The once faint tap, tap, tap had become a rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat echoing from the corners of the room. Paul's mind raced. He had no idea what he was facing, only that it wasn't just some lost soul or vengeful spirit. This was something far darker, something ancient. It was as if the woods themselves had given birth to this entity, a creature tied to the land, to Camden, to something long buried beneath its surface. The Watcher's limbs stretched unnaturally, its form twisting in grotesque angles. The air around it vibrated with an energy Paul couldn't comprehend. He tried to call out, to warn his team, but no sound escaped his lips. His throat was dry, tight with terror. The figure's glowing eyes locked onto his, and in those eyes, Paul saw something he couldn't shake, something that made his stomach churn with dread. It was as if the Watcher had been waiting for him. With a sudden, jerking motion, the figure lunged forward, its long, twisted arms reaching out to grab him. Paul barely managed to leap to the side, his body slamming into the wall. The cabin creaked under the weight of the entity's movements. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the house itself was alive, responding to the Watcher's presence. The symbols on the wall began to glow with an eerie, sickly light, illuminating the room in a haunting hue. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, his mind a blur. He couldn't run, he couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go, nothing to hide behind. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just a shadow, it was part of Camden's past, part of the very soil the town was built on. And it had been waiting. But why? What was the Watcher after? He remembered the words scrawled on the wall, Watcher, and then something clicked in his mind. This wasn't just a creature of the woods. It was connected to the town's history, to the disappearances that had haunted Camden for generations. The figure was the manifestation of something much darker. It had been feeding on the fear of the town, on the terror it instilled in its people, and now it was ready to claim its next victim. Suddenly, a terrible realization struck Paul. The Watcher wasn't just after him, it was after everyone. The town had been cursed, bound to this entity, feeding its hunger for generations. And now it was his turn to pay the price. With no time to waste, Paul turned and fled from the cabin, his legs moving as if on their own. He could feel the Watcher's presence behind him, its eyes burning into his back, urging him forward. The woods were thick with shadows, the trees closing in around him like a maze. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves made him jump, his pulse racing. He didn't dare look back. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed through the woods, but Paul couldn't stop. His only hope was to get out, to warn the others before it was too late. The Watcher, the entity that had been haunting Camden for generations, wasn't just a creature in the woods, it was a curse, a force born of Camden's dark past, and it was intimately tied to Paul himself. He could feel it now, deep inside, a gnawing presence, an ancient force stirring within his own blood. As the Watcher's glowing eyes locked onto him once more, Paul staggered back, his mind spinning. The others, Sheriff Thompson, the search team, they were all watching, but Paul no longer felt like he was in control. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy, as though the very earth was shifting beneath him. It wasn't just fear that gripped Paul now, it was understanding. He had been part of the Watcher's story all along, just as much a prisoner as the town itself. The Watcher had been waiting, not for the people of Camden, but for him. And now Paul could feel the horrible truth pulling him toward it. As if in a trance, Paul's feet moved before his mind could stop them, his body drawing closer to the entity, drawn to the pulsating glow of its eyes. The memories of his childhood flooded back, his father's cryptic warnings, the strange tales about Elias Camden, the town's founder, and the pact he had made with something far darker than mere superstition. His father had never spoken of it openly, but Paul had always sensed there was something his family had been hiding. The town's history, the disappearances, the strange occurrences, they had all been tied to him. Paul's bloodline was intertwined with the evil that had cursed Camden. Elias Camden, the town's founder, had made a deal with a powerful, ancient entity to ensure the prosperity of the town. In exchange, every decade, the town would offer up a life, a sacrifice. But over time, the pact had grown stronger, the sacrifices more frequent. The Watcher had been the manifestation of this pact, a force that fed on fear, on death, on the souls it had claimed over the years. And now it was Paul's turn. The Watcher's form shifted, its twisted limbs stretching and bending in unnatural ways. But its glowing eyes never left Paul's face. As he stood there, staring into those eyes, he felt something deep inside him change. His body tensed, his vision blurred. The Watcher's essence was seeping into him, merging with his soul. He could feel it. He was the Watcher. He always had been. The sheriff and the others were shouting now, pulling at him. But Paul didn't respond. He didn't want to. They were nothing more than distant figures, meaningless in the presence of the Watcher. He could hear their voices fading, their panic growing as the reality of what was happening became clear. In his mind, a flood of memories rose to the surface. Memories of things he couldn't explain. He had always been drawn to the woods, to the pines. He had heard the whispers as a child, the unsettling sensation of being watched. Even as a boy, he had felt the presence of something out there, lurking, waiting. He had dismissed it as superstition, something his father had tried to warn him about in hushed tones. But now, those childhood fears took on a new meaning. Paul had never been the town's savior. He had always been the Watcher, the very force that had haunted Camden for decades. And he had unknowingly become the next vessel for the ancient evil. The Watcher's soul had passed from one host to another throughout the centuries, always claiming a new body, always watching over the town. As the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, Paul felt an overwhelming surge of power course through him. The Watcher was within him, and he was in control of it. But it wasn't a victory. No, it was the final betrayal. The Watcher was no longer an outside force lurking in the shadows. It was him. He had been born of it, and the Watcher had finally found its true vessel. The entity had been waiting for Paul to awaken to his true nature. All those disappearances, the creeping fear, the whispers in the dark, they had all been leading him to this moment. The sheriff and his team were now struggling to comprehend what was happening. But Paul's gaze had shifted. He wasn't the man they had once known. There was nothing left of Paul Grant in his eyes, only the cold, hollow stare of the Watcher. His skin began to pale, his features becoming sharper, more angular. He was transforming before their eyes, no longer human, but something other. "You don't understand," Paul, or what was left of him, said in a voice that was no longer entirely his own. It was the voice of the Watcher, ancient and filled with a strange, chilling power. "You were never meant to survive. Camden was always mine to watch." The sheriff took a step back, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His hand hovered near his holster, though he knew, deep down, that no weapon could stop what he was witnessing. This wasn't something human. This wasn't something he could arrest or lock away. It was far beyond his understanding, and that helplessness made the terror all the worse. "Paul," the sheriff whispered, his voice cracking, "what's happening to you?" But Paul, or whatever Paul had become, did not respond. His eyes, once warm and familiar, were now glowing embers of amber light, pulsing faintly in the dark. His posture was different, unnatural. His limbs hung loosely, like a marionette whose strings were pulled by an unseen hand. Yet there was power radiating from him, a suffocating force that made the air heavy and thick. The others in the search party were frozen in place. caught between fear and disbelief. One man muttered a prayer under his breath, while another dropped his flashlight, the beam shaking wildly as it illuminated the towering pines. Paul slowly raised his head, his lips curling into a smile that didn't belong on a human face. "This is what it's always been about," he said, his voice layered, as if another presence spoke through him. "You don't understand, do you? None of you ever have." "What are you talking about?" the sheriff demanded, though his voice lacked the authority it usually carried. He took another step back, trying to steady his trembling hand. Paul's head tilted, the motion jerky, like a predator studying its prey. "Camden is not your town. It never was. It's mine. You've been living on borrowed time, all of you. The Pines see everything. They take what they're owed." "No," the sheriff whispered, his voice almost drowned out by the wind rising through the trees. He could feel the truth in Paul's words, feel it like a cold hand gripping his chest. This isn't real." "Oh, it's real," Paul replied, his voice growing darker, more guttural. "Camden has always been a bargain. Sacrifices for prosperity, death for survival, but that bargain comes at a cost." Paul's body began to shift subtly, his form elongating, his shadow stretching unnaturally against the trees. The sheriff stumbled back, his mind racing, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. The others shouted now, panicked cries of terror, but none dared move. They could only watch as Paul was swallowed by the presence that had haunted Camden for centuries. "It was never about stopping the Watcher," Paul continued, his voice now resonating with an otherworldly cadence. "It was about becoming it, and now, the pact is complete." The sheriff felt bile rise in his throat. He thought about the stories his grandfather used to tell him, the warnings about the Pines, the disappearances that everyone in Camden tried to forget. He thought about the missing hikers, the hunters who never returned, the countless faces on missing persons flyers that had quietly been taken down when hope was lost. This wasn't a series of random tragedies. It was a cycle, and Paul Grant had been destined to be part of it. Paul's glowing eyes turned toward the sheriff one last time. "Run," he said, the word laced with menace. "Run, while you still can." But the sheriff couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the ground, his mind paralyzed by the enormity of what he was seeing. Only when Paul, or the thing Paul had become, let out a low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees did the sheriff's survival instinct kick in. He turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, the others did the same, their screams mingling with the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves. But no matter how far or fast they ran, the woods seemed endless. The trees loomed higher, the shadows darker, the path back to town disappearing into the night. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Hours later, as dawn broke over Camden, the sheriff stumbled out of the woods, alone. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He fell to his knees on the edge of the highway, trembling, his eyes darting wildly, as if expecting something to lunge out of the tree line after him. But the forest remained still. He couldn't explain to the others what had happened. He couldn't put into words the horror he had witnessed, the transformation he had seen. The search team was gone. Paul Grant was gone. Only the Pines remained, standing silent and indifferent to the lives they had claimed. As the sheriff sat there, staring at the road stretching out before him, he realized that Camden's story wasn't one of heroes or resolutions. It was one of inevitability. The town had been built on blood, and that blood would continue to be spilled. The Watcher was no longer an entity in the shadows. It was part of Camden, part of its people, its legacy. And though the sheriff escaped the forest that day, he knew the truth would never leave him. The Watcher was in the air, in the soil, in the roots of the towering pines that surrounded the town. It was Camden's curse, and no one who lived there could escape it for long. The sheriff stood on shaky legs and looked back at the woods. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a sound almost like laughter. He turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer, and walked back toward town, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him like a stone. Camden would carry on. The people would go about their lives, pretending not to notice the shadows that crept closer with each passing year. But the sheriff knew better now. The forest was always hungry, and the cycle would begin again. And that concludes The Shadows in the Pines. The twisted fate of Camden and its watcher leaves us with one unsettling truth. Some places are better left undisturbed. If this story gave you goosebumps, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever felt like something or someone was watching you? If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like this video and share it with friends who love a good scare. And for more spine-tingling tales, check out our playlist of true crime and horror stories. You'll find tales that are guaranteed to keep you awake at night. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay safe and stay out of the woods.